The massive space station called Nexus Prime floated in the dark void between three star systems. It was bigger than most moons and housed the most powerful beings in the galaxy. This was where the Galactic Federation made all their decisions. 47 different alien species sent their best representatives here to argue and vote on matters that affected trillions of lives across thousands of worlds. Ambassador Lisa Turner walked through the grand halls of Nexus Prime feeling very small. She was human, and that meant almost nothing here. The other ambassadors towered over her or slithered past her or floated by her without even looking down. Some had scales that changed colors when they were angry. Others had tentacles that moved like snakes. A few looked like walking crystals that sang instead of talking. All of them treated humans like children who had wandered into an adult conversation. Lisa had been serving as Earth's representative for 5 years now. In that time, she had watched the Federation ignore every single suggestion that came from human space. When human scientists discovered a new type of fuel that burned cleaner than anything the aliens used, the Federation said it was too dangerous. When human engineers designed ships that could fly faster than most alien vessels, the Federation said the technology was primitive. When human doctors found cures for diseases that had plagued other species for centuries, the Federation said the treatments were unproven. The humans had only joined the Federation 200 years ago. To most aliens, this was like yesterday. Some of the species in the Federation had been traveling between stars for thousands of years before humans even learned to make fire. They remembered when Earth was just another ball of rock with some interesting chemistry happening on its surface. Now these same humans were trying to tell ancient civilizations how to run the galaxy. Captain Jake Morrison commanded the human defense fleet from his ship the New Horizon. His fleet was small compared to the massive armadas that other species brought to Federation space. The Zephyrians had ships the size of cities that could destroy planets with a single shot. The Machine Collective built vessels that could repair themselves and think faster than any biological brain. The hegemony of Vel created warships that existed in multiple dimensions at the same time. Jake's ships looked like toys next to these giants, but they were fast and they were tough, and the crews that ran them were some of the best in the galaxy. Human ships might not have the biggest guns or the strongest shields, but they had something that many alien vessels lacked. They had crews who would never give up and never stop fighting no matter how bad things got. The first reports of the Void Swarm came from the edge of the galaxy where few species bothered to go. Mining ships and research stations simply vanished, without sending any distress signals. Long-range sensors showed that entire star systems were going dark. Not destroyed or abandoned, but actually disappearing from all instruments and detection. Methods. Dr. Nathan Cross was the first human scientist to study the data. He worked in a small laboratory on one of the outer research stations and spent his days looking at things that most people would rather not think about. Strange alien artifacts, dangerous biological samples, and energy readings that made no sense according to any known laws of physics. When Nathan saw the reports about the disappearing systems, he knew something terrible was happening. The pattern was too organized to be natural and too widespread to be an accident. Something was moving through space and eating everything in its path. Not just planets and ships, but the very space around them. Nathan sent his findings to Admiral Susan Blake, the highest-ranking human military officer in Federation space. Susan had fought in 3 different wars and commanded fleets in battles that most people only read about in history books. She was smart and tough and had earned the respect of even the most stubborn alien commanders. Susan looked at Nathan's data and felt her blood turn cold. The Void Swarm wasn't just destroying things. It was learning from everything it consumed. Each attack was more sophisticated than the last. Each new system fell faster than the one before. Whatever intelligence was behind this had studied every major species in the galaxy and was preparing something much worse than simple destruction. Susan requested an emergency meeting with the Grand Council. She prepared detailed reports and tactical analyses. She brought holographic displays that showed exactly how the swarm moved and what it was capable of doing. She even had recordings from the few ships that had managed to escape from the edge of the galaxy. The meeting was held in the council chamber at the center of Nexus Prime. Representatives from all 47 species gathered in a vast circular room where each delegation sat in sections, designed for their particular biological needs. The air was filled with different atmospheric mixtures and the lighting was adjusted so that every type of vision could see clearly. Susan stood at the center of the chamber and activated her presentation. She showed the council members how 17 star systems had simply ceased to exist. She explained how the swarm seemed to be testing different approaches and learning from each encounter. She warned them that conventional weapons and standard defensive strategies would not work against this enemy. The response was exactly what Susan had feared it would be. Kethvar, the massive Zephyrian who commanded the Federation's military forces, raised his scaled hand and dismissed her concerns with a wave. His voice boomed through the chamber as he spoke about the superiority of Zephyrian battle tactics and the proven strength of Federation defenses. Other council members joined in with their own objections. The crystalline representative from the Singing Worlds claimed that their harmonic shields could deflect any attack. The slug-like ambassador from the merchant guilds worried more about trade disruptions than actual military threats. The floating jellyfish from the deep current said that the swarm was probably just a natural phenomenon that would burn itself out given time. Lisa Turner tried to support Susan's presentation, but her voice was lost in the noise of 46 other species all talking at once. The humans were the youngest members of the Federation, and their opinions carried the least weight in any discussion. When the final vote was taken, the council decided to send a small patrol fleet to investigate the edge of the galaxy, but no major military action would be taken. Susan left the council chamber knowing that she had just watched the galaxy sign its own death warrant. The greatest civilizations in known space had just decided that their pride was more important than their survival. She looked at Lisa and saw the same understanding in the ambassador's eyes. The Federation would not act until it was far too late to save anyone. As they walked back toward the human section of Nexus Prime, Susan began thinking about things that no one was supposed to think about. Contingency plans that had been classified beyond the highest security levels. Protocols that had been written by paranoid military planners who assumed that someday humanity might find itself completely alone in a hostile universe. The Void Swarm was coming and the Federation refused to take it seriously. Soon Susan would have to make decisions that would change the course of human history forever. 3 months after the council meeting, the first refugee ships began arriving at Federation core worlds. They came in damaged vessels with hull breaches and failing life support systems. The crews were traumatized and spoke in whispers about things that made no sense to anyone who listened to their reports. The refugees told stories about planets that had simply stopped existing. Not blown apart or burned to ash, but completely removed from reality as if they had never been there at all. They described fleets of ships that had flown into dark clouds and vanished without even having time to send distress signals. Some survivors claimed they had watched their homeworlds fold in on themselves like paper being crumpled by invisible hands. Colonel Maria Santos was assigned to investigate these reports. She was a career military officer who had spent 20 years flying reconnaissance missions in the most dangerous parts of space. Her ship, the Silent Runner, was built for stealth operations and could slip past enemy sensors without being detected. If anyone could get close to the Void Swarm and return with useful information, it would be Maria. The Silent Runner departed from Earth's orbital defense station on a cold Tuesday morning. Maria's crew consisted of 12 specialists who had volunteered for what everyone knew was likely a suicide mission. They flew toward the edge of the galaxy where 17 star systems had already gone dark. Their ship was equipped with every type of sensor and recording device that human technology could provide. It took them 6 weeks to reach the boundary zone where normal space ended and something else began. Maria had seen combat in 3 different wars, but nothing had prepared her for what she found at the edge of the galaxy. There was a wall of absolute darkness that stretched across light years of space. It wasn't just black like the normal void between stars. It was an absence of everything that made reality possible. When the Silent Runner's sensors tried to scan beyond the wall, the instruments simply stopped working. Not broken or damaged, but shut down as if they had forgotten how to function. Maria ordered her crew to take readings from as close as they dared to approach. What they discovered defied every law of physics that humanity had ever learned. The void swarm wasn't destroying matter and energy. It was erasing the concept of existence itself. Space, time, gravity, and even the basic forces that held atoms together were being systematically removed from the areas the swarm had consumed. The entities that made up the swarm were feeding on something far more fundamental than physical matter. Maria managed to capture one of the smaller entities that had wandered away from the main swarm. It was roughly the size of a human, but had no fixed shape or form. Sometimes it looked like flowing shadow, and other times it appeared as a whole cut out of reality itself. The thing was contained in a special isolation chamber that prevented it from affecting the rest of the ship. Dr. Elena Rodriguez examined the captured entity from her research facility on Luna Station. Elena was one of the galaxy's leading experts on quantum consciousness and had spent her career studying how thoughts and awareness interacted with the fundamental structure of reality. What she found when she analyzed the entity made her realize that the Federation was facing something far worse than anyone had imagined. The void swarm was feeding on consciousness itself. Every thought, memory, dream, and experience that intelligent beings created was being consumed by these entities. They weren't just destroying civilizations. They were eating the very essence of what made life meaningful and replacing it with an empty void that could never be filled again. Elena's research showed that the entities responded to specific neural frequencies that were unique to each species. The swarm had learned to recognize the thought patterns of every major civilization in the galaxy. It knew how each species communicated, how they processed information, and most importantly, how they experienced fear and despair. The entities were literally becoming stronger by feeding on the terror and hopelessness of their victims. Every planet that fell to the swarm made the next attack more devastating. Every species that was consumed added its knowledge and capabilities to the growing intelligence that controlled the void entities. Elena worked day and night to develop some kind of defense against this threat. She discovered that it was possible to create a consciousness barrier that would temporarily sever the connection between thought and the quantum field that the entities used to track their prey. The process would require massive amounts of energy and would render entire sectors of space uninhabitable for decades. General Ryan Murphy received Elena's research data and immediately understood the implications. The consciousness barrier might stop the void swarm from advancing, but it would require humanity to sacrifice 12 of their outer colonies. More than 50 million people would have to be evacuated from their homes and might never be able to return. Ryan took the proposal to President Carolyn Jackson, who was dealing with growing panic among the civilian population. The news about the void swarm had leaked to the press, and people were demanding answers that their government could not provide. Some colonies were already preparing to evacuate even though no official orders had been given. Carolyn studied Elena's research and realized that humanity was being asked to make an impossible choice. They could try to save the galaxy by sacrificing their own people, or they could protect their colonies and watch the universe burn around them. Either way, millions of humans would suffer for a decision that the Federation should have made months ago. Meanwhile, the Grand Council continued to debate and argue while more star systems disappeared every week. The Zephyrian fleet had been dispatched to engage the swarm directly, but they had not been heard from in over a month. The bioships of the collective had attempted to adapt their living hulls to resist the void entities, but their vessels had been twisted into shapes that hurt to look at. The other species in the Federation were finally beginning to understand that they were facing something beyond their ability to comprehend or defeat. But instead of working together to find solutions, they began looking for someone to blame. Rumors spread that humanity's research into consciousness Barriers was somehow connected to the appearance of the Void Swarm ambassador. Lisa Turner found herself defending her species against accusations that grew more serious every day. Some council members suggested that humans had created the swarm as a weapon and were now pretending to help while secretly controlling the entities. Others claimed that humanity's neural patterns were somehow different from other species, and that this difference had attracted the swarm to the galaxy. The accusations were ridiculous, but they gave the other species someone to focus their fear and anger on, rather than admit their own failures. The Federation was preparing to make humanity the scapegoat for the greatest disaster in galactic history. Lisa could see the writing on the wall, and she knew that her people were running out of time to find allies or solutions. As the Void Swarm continued its advance toward the core worlds, Maria Santos completed her reconnaissance mission and began the long journey back to human space. The information she carried would change everything, but she wondered if there would still be a Federation left to save by the time she arrived. The emergency session of the Grand Council was called after 3 core Federation worlds went silent in a single day. Nexus Prime had never seen such chaos as representatives from 47 species all tried to speak at once. The great chamber, filled with sounds that no human throat could make as aliens roared, whistled, and sang their fear and anger into the recycled air. Ambassador Lisa Turner sat in the human section watching the panic spread through the council like a disease. The same beings who had dismissed humanity's warnings 6 months ago were now demanding immediate action against the Void Swarm. The same military commanders who had called human tactics primitive were now begging for any solution that might save their worlds. The Zephyrian fleet that had been sent to stop the swarm was gone. All 200 ships, including the flagship Eternal Glory, had vanished without sending a single message back to Federation space. The bioships of the Collective had tried to adapt their living hulls to resist the void entities, but the results had been worse than destruction. The few vessels that returned were twisted into shapes that defied understanding, and their crews had been driven insane by what they had experienced. Admiral Susan Blake stood before the council once again, but this time the chamber was silent. When she spoke, she presented Dr. Elena Rodriguez's consciousness barrier plan in simple terms that even the most panicked representative could understand. Humanity was offering to sacrifice 12 of their outer colonies to create a firewall that might stop the swarm's advance toward the core worlds. The barrier would work by severing the quantum connection between consciousness and reality in a massive zone of space. The void entities fed on thoughts and awareness, so cutting off their food supply might force them to retreat or at least pause their advance. The cost would be enormous, but it was the only plan that had any chance of success. Susan explained that humanity needed help evacuating 50 million people from the colonies that would be sacrificed. They also needed access to Federation transportation, networks, and temporary housing for the refugees. In return for this assistance, humanity would implement the consciousness barrier and hold the line against the swarm while the other species prepared their own defenses. The response from the council was swift and brutal. Kethvar, the massive Zephyrian commander, accused humanity of creating the Void Swarm as a weapon to destroy the Federation. The crystalline representative from the Singing Worlds claimed that the consciousness barrier plan was actually designed to give humans control over other species' minds. The floating jellyfish from the deep currents suggested that humans were in league with the entities and were offering false solutions to hide their betrayal. Within hours of Susan's presentation, the Grand Council voted to declare humanity a contaminated species. Economic sanctions were imposed that cut off all trade between human space and the Federation. Human ships were banned from Federation starbases and orbital facilities. Most importantly, any Federation citizen who helped humanity in any way would be considered a traitor and subject to imprisonment or worse. The vote was 46-1, with only the human representative voting against the sanctions. Lisa Turner watched her career and her hopes for peaceful cooperation die in that moment. The species that humanity had tried so hard to join and serve had cast them out just when they needed help the most. President Carolyn Jackson received the news in her underground command center beneath the city of New Geneva. She was a woman who had spent 30 years in politics building bridges between different groups and finding peaceful solutions to complex problems. Now she was being asked to make decisions that would determine whether humanity survived as a species. Carolyn activated Protocol Omega, a classified plan that had been developed by paranoid military strategists who had never trusted the Federation completely. Every human world received the same coded message at exactly the same time. Prepare for immediate evacuation. All civilian populations were to be ready for transport within 72 hours. Military forces would hold defensive positions as long as possible before following the civilians into exile. Commander Alex Foster was in charge of implementing the evacuation plan. He had access to every human ship in the galaxy, including military vessels, commercial transports, and private craft. The logistics were staggering, but Alex had been preparing for this possibility since the day humans joined the Federation. The civilian ships were loaded first. Families with children, elderly citizens, and anyone who could not contribute to the military effort were given priority for evacuation. Essential personnel like doctors, engineers, and teachers were assigned to specific ships to ensure that human civilization could continue even in exile. Chief Engineer Danny Clark worked around the clock to modify human FTL drives with Dr. Elena Rodriguez's consciousness-dampening technology. The modifications would make human ships invisible to the void swarm by cutting off their connection to the quantum field that the entities used for tracking. The downside was that modified ships would also be cut off from most galactic communication networks. Elena supervised the installation of the dampening systems on every human vessel. The technology was experimental and dangerous, but it was their only hope of escaping the galaxy without being followed by the swarm. Each ship that received the modifications became a ghost that could travel through space without leaving any trace of its passage. As the evacuation fleets began to form up at the edge of human space, something unexpected happened. Alien ships started arriving from all across Federation territory. Not official Federation vessels, but private craft and merchant ships, carrying refugees who had been abandoned by their own governments. The aliens begged for passage on human ships, or escort to safe areas beyond the galaxy. Some offered valuable technology or information in exchange for protection. Others simply pleaded for their lives as their home worlds burned behind them. Many were species that had never spoken to humans before and had no idea how to communicate their desperation. Commander Patricia Wells faced the hardest decision of her military career as thousands of alien refugees converged on the human evacuation routes. Her ships were already overcrowded with human civilians, and their resources were stretched to the breaking point. Taking on additional passengers would slow down the evacuation and might doom everyone. Some human captains made their own choices and rescued who they could. Captain Helen Price filled her transport ship with alien children whose parents had been killed in the swarm attacks. Captain Robert Gray used his cargo hauler to evacuate an entire research station full of scientists from 12 different species. Other commanders followed orders and maintained course toward the rendezvous points. In deep space, they had to watch alien ships burn while they protected their own people. The lucky aliens who were saved found themselves cut off from their home species and completely dependent on human generosity for survival. Dr. Nathan Cross made a final discovery as the last human research stations prepared to abandon Federation space. The Void Swarm was not a weapon created by some ancient enemy or a natural disaster that had emerged from the void between galaxies. It was something far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The swarm was the galaxy's own immune system. After studying the quantum patterns left behind by the entities, Nathan realized that the swarm had been triggered by the Federation itself. 3,000 years of expansion and domination had upset the cosmic balance, and the galaxy was trying to heal itself by removing the infection. Nathan's data suggested that humanity's exile might not be rejection but salvation. They were leaving before the galaxy decided that they too needed to be removed. consciousness dampening technology that was supposed to hide them from the swarm might actually be protecting them from a cleansing that would consume every intelligent species in Federation space as the last human evacuation. Ships cleared. The outer boundaries of Federation territory. Admiral Susan Blake transmitted a single message on all communication frequencies. The message was brief and cold and carried the weight of humanity's final judgment on the species that had cast them out. We warned you about the danger coming to destroy us all. We offered our help and our sacrifice to save your worlds and your people. You chose pride over wisdom and fear over cooperation. What happens to you now is not our responsibility. You made your choice and now you must live with the consequences. Then the human fleet engaged their modified drives and vanished into the darkness between galaxies. They left no trace of their passage and no way for anyone to follow their path. The species that had rejected humanity's help were now truly alone, with the void swarm advancing toward their core worlds. In the weeks that followed, the Federation's remaining military forces tried to implement their own version of the consciousness barrier. Without human assistance and expertise, the results were catastrophic. Entire fleets were lost when their barrier generators exploded. Planets that tried to protect themselves were cut off from reality and their populations simply ceased to exist. The void swarm continued its advance toward the heart of Federation space, consuming everything in its path and growing stronger with each victory. The greatest civilizations in the galaxy had chosen to face this threat alone, and they were learning too late that some enemies could not be defeated. The void swarm reached the core systems of Federation space like a black tide washing over everything that had once been proud and mighty. Nexus Prime, the Great, symbol of galactic unity and cooperation, was consumed in less than an hour. The Grand Council chamber, where 47 species had argued and debated for 3,000 years, became nothing more than empty space filled with quantum static. Captain Jake Morrison commanded the human rear guard from his ship, the New Horizon, as the last evacuation fleets escaped toward the galactic rim. His small fleet of modified destroyers could not fight the void swarm directly, but they could buy precious time for the civilian ships that were still fleeing Federation territory. Jake's ships used Dr. Rodriguez's consciousness-dampening fields to create pockets of dead space that the swarm entities could not penetrate. These zones were like bubbles of nothingness where thoughts and awareness simply could not exist. The void entities would approach these areas and then turn away as if they had forgotten what they were looking for. The dampening fields were dangerous to use because they affected human crews as well as the swarm. Jake's people had to work in shifts, spending only a few hours at a time in the dead zones before rotating out to areas where their minds could function normally. Too much exposure to the dampening fields would leave a person unable to think or feel anything ever again behind. Jake's defensive line, the Federation's greatest civilizations, were falling one by one. The Zephyrian Empire that had ruled star systems for millennia was reduced to scattered refugee ships fleeing toward unknown destinations. The machine collective that had once boasted of their immortal digital consciousness watched their networks dissolve into random noise. The hegemony of Vel that had claimed dominion over multiple dimensions found their sonic barriers useless against an enemy that existed beyond the reach of thought itself. Commander Patricia Wells faced an impossible situation as thousands of alien ships converged on the human evacuation routes. The same species that had voted to exile humanity were now begging for rescue from the very disaster they had refused to prevent. Their proud fleets were broken and their mighty civilizations were crumbling into ash and memory. Patricia's transport ships were already filled beyond capacity with human refugees. Every corridor was packed with families carrying whatever belongings they could manage. The life support systems were running at dangerous levels and food supplies were calculated down to the last ration bar. Taking on additional passengers would mean condemning everyone aboard to a slow death in the void between galaxies. Some of the alien refugees offered valuable technology in exchange for passage. Others promised to share the locations of hidden worlds where humans could establish new colonies. A few simply begged for their lives as their home planets burned behind them. The most desperate ones tried to force their way aboard human ships only to be turned away by security teams who had orders to protect their own people first. Captain Helen Price made the decision to break protocol and rescue a group of alien children whose parents had been killed in the swarm attacks. Her transport ship, the Safe Harbor, was already overcrowded, but she could not bring herself to abandon youngsters who would die without help. The alien children spoke languages that no human understood and ate food that made them sick, but Helen's crew did their best to care for them. Captain Robert Gray used his massive cargo hauler to evacuate an entire research station full of scientists from 12 different species. The researchers had been working on experimental weapons that might have stopped the void swarm if they had been given more time. Now their laboratories were empty and their projects would never be completed, but at least their knowledge would. SURVIV Dr. Elena Rodriguez worked frantically in her mobile laboratory as the human fleet prepared for the final jump to intergalactic space. She was analyzing the quantum signatures left behind by the void swarm and making a discovery that would change everything humanity thought they knew about their situation. The swarm was not a random force of destruction or even a weapon created by some ancient enemy. It was the galaxy's own defense mechanism responding to what it perceived as a dangerous infection. The Federation's 3,000 years of expansion and control had triggered an immune response that was designed to cleanse the cosmic ecosystem of species that had grown too dominant. Elena's data showed that the galaxy itself was a living organism of sorts, with consciousness and awareness spread across billions of star systems. The void swarm was like white blood cells attacking a disease that threatened the health of the entire galactic body. The Federation species had become so successful and so widespread that they were disrupting the natural balance of life and death that kept the galaxy healthy. Humanity's exile might not have been a punishment, but a blessing in disguise. The consciousness-dampening technology that was supposed to hide them from the swarm was actually protecting them from the galaxy's immune system. By cutting themselves off from the quantum field that connected all living things, humans were becoming invisible to the cosmic intelligence that had decided the Federation needed to be destroyed. Commander Alex Foster received Elena's research data as the human fleet reached the edge of galactic space. The implications were staggering and terrifying at the same time. Humanity was not just escaping from the void swarm, but from the galaxy itself. They were about to become a species without a home, wandering in the darkness between stars with no possibility of ever returning. The modified FTL drives the Chief Engineer Danny Clark had installed on every human ship were designed to work in the void between galaxies where normal spacetime had different properties. The ships would be able to travel vast distances, but they would be completely cut off from the galactic communication networks and navigation systems that made interstellar civilization possible. As the first human ships began their jump to intergalactic space, something unexpected happened. Long-range sensors detected massive explosions in the Federation's core territories. Not the slow consumption that the void swarm usually brought, but violent detonations that lit up entire star systems before fading into darkness. The remaining Federation fleets were trying to implement their own version of the consciousness barrier without human assistance or expertise. The results were catastrophic beyond anything the aliens had imagined. Their barrier generators were exploding and taking whole planets with them. Their attempts to sever the connection between thought and reality were creating tears in spacetime that swallowed everything nearby. Merle Susan Blake watched the destruction through her ship's sensors and felt no satisfaction in being proven right. She had warned the Federation that the consciousness barrier was dangerous and required precise calibration to work safely. The alien scientists had ignored her warnings and were now paying the ultimate price for their arrogance. The human fleet completed its jump sequence and vanished into the void between galaxies without any fanfare or ceremony. No speeches were given about humanity's noble sacrifice or their hopes for the future. No messages were sent back to the dying Federation expressing regret or offering final assistance. The humans simply faded away like ghosts leaving a haunted house. In the days that followed, The Federation's communication networks carried increasingly desperate messages from the remaining alien civilizations. They begged for humanity to return and help them fight the Void Swarm. They offered to make humans equal partners in the Federation and give them voting rights that had been denied for 2 centuries. Some even suggested making humanity the dominant species and letting them lead the galaxy's defense against the swarm, but there was no one left to hear these messages. The human ships were already millions of light years away from Federation space and moving deeper into the intergalactic void. With each passing hour, their consciousness-dampening fields made them invisible to any form of detection, and their modified drives left no trace that could be followed. The species that had cast humanity out were now truly alone with their pride and their fear and the advancing darkness that consumed everything in its path. They had chosen to face the greatest threat in galactic history without the help of the one species that had offered a solution. Now they would learn whether their ancient wisdom and superior technology were enough to save them from the void that approached their worlds behind the fleeing human fleet. The Void Swarm continued its methodical advance through Federation space. System after system went dark as the entities fed on the consciousness and memories of entire civilizations. The greatest achievements in galactic history were being reduced to quantum noise and empty space. Within 6 months, 47 species that had ruled the galaxy for 3 millennia would be nothing more than scattered refugees fleeing toward the edge of known space. Their mighty fleets would be cosmic dust, and their proud civilizations would exist only in the memories of the few survivors who managed to escape the swarm's advance. The galaxy that had rejected humanity's warnings and cast them out as contaminated was learning too late that there were worse things than accepting help from a younger species. There were much worse things than swallowing their pride and admitting they had been wrong. The darkness between galaxies was colder and emptier than anything humanity had ever experienced. There were no stars to guide their way and no planets to call home. The human fleet drifted through an endless void where the only light came from their own ships and the distant glow of galaxies millions of years away. Admiral Susan Blake had grown old during the journey into exile. Her hair was white now, and her face was lined with the weight of decisions that had saved her species but cost them everything they had ever known. She stood on the bridge of her flagship, looking out at the scattered points of light that marked the location of human ships, spread across hundreds of light years of empty space. The evacuation had saved nearly 3 billion humans, but at a terrible cost. Families had been separated during the hasty departure from Federation space. Children had been born who would never see a world with a sun or breathe air that came from living plants. The elderly remembered Earth and the colonies, but the young ones knew only the cold metal corridors of ships that traveled through eternal night. Dr. Elena Rodriguez continued her research in a laboratory built inside an asteroid that the fleet had captured during their exodus. The consciousness-dampening fields that protected humanity from the Void Swarm had unexpected side effects that were becoming more apparent with each passing year. The human children who had been born in the void were developing abilities that no one had seen before. Some of the young ones could sense things happening on ships that were light years away. Others could predict when mechanical systems would fail or when food supplies would run low. A few seemed to be able to communicate without speaking or moving their lips. Elena documented these changes but could not explain how exposure to the intergalactic void was transforming human consciousness itself. Captain Jake Morrison commanded one of the deep scout ships that ventured far from the main fleet to search for resources and new places to establish colonies. His ship, the Far Wanderer, had been modified with the most advanced sensors that human technology could build. What he discovered during his long-range patrols made him question everything he thought he knew about the universe. There were things moving in the darkness. Between galaxies that were older and stranger than the Void Swarm, Jake's sensors detected structures that were larger than solar systems but seemed to be made of pure thought instead of matter. He found regions of space where time moved backwards and areas where the laws of physics worked differently than they did in normal reality. Most disturbing of all, Jake began to detect signals coming from the direction of their old galaxy. Not the random noise of cosmic radiation, but organized patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. Something was rebuilding in the space that the void swarm had consumed. New stars were being created and new worlds were taking shape, but they were not following the natural processes that govern normal stellar formation. President Carolyn Jackson had established the first permanent human colony on a rogue planet that drifted through the void without orbiting any star. The world they called New Hope was a frozen ball of rock and ice that received no warmth from outside sources. Human engineers had to build massive fusion reactors to heat the underground cities where people could live and work. Life on New Hope was hard, but it was life nonetheless. Children played in heated tunnels carved from solid rock while their parents worked to extract minerals and water from the planet's frozen surface. Schools were built in pressurized caverns where teachers used holographic displays to show students what forests and oceans had looked like on the worlds their grandparents remembered. The alien refugees who had been rescued during the evacuation struggled to adapt to their new existence. Many of them had evolved on worlds with multiple suns and rich atmospheres filled with exotic gases. The cold artificial environment of human colonies was slowly killing them despite the best efforts of human doctors and engineers. Captain Helen Price established a special facility for the alien children she had rescued from the void swarm. The young ones adapted better than the adults, but they carried deep psychological scars from watching their families and civilizations die. Some of them had abilities that were similar to what human children were developing, but their powers worked in different ways that Helen's medical staff could not understand. Commander Alex Foster was in charge of maintaining the human fleet as it spread across the intergalactic void. Ships that had been designed to operate near stars and planets were breaking down in ways that no one had anticipated. The cosmic radiation between galaxies was different from anything human engineers had encountered, and it was slowly degrading the hull plating and electronic systems that kept everyone alive. Alex's teams worked around the clock to develop new materials and technologies that could survive in the harsh environment between galaxies. They learned to harvest exotic particles from the void itself and use them to power systems that could not function with normal fuel sources. Humanity was being forced to evolve not just biologically, but technologically as well. Dr. Nathan Cross made a discovery that changed everything the human leadership thought they knew about their situation. His long-range telescopes detected something impossible happening in the galaxy they had fled. The void swarm had not simply destroyed the Federation and then moved on to consume other regions of space. Instead, it was systematically rebuilding everything it had destroyed, but according to a completely different design. New star systems were being created with artificial suns that burned at frequencies that biological life could not survive. Planets were being reshaped into geometric forms that served purposes no organic intelligence could understand. The entire galaxy was being converted into something that existed beyond the reach of normal consciousness and awareness. Nathan realized that the void swarm had never intended to destroy the galaxy permanently. It was performing a kind of cosmic surgery to remove what it perceived as an infection and replace it with something that would serve the galaxy's true purpose. The Federation species had been eliminated not because they were evil, but because they were preventing the galaxy from fulfilling its destiny. The implications of Nathan's discovery were staggering and terrifying. Humanity had not escaped from a temporary disaster, but from a fundamental transformation that would make their old home permanently uninhabitable for any form of biological life. There could be no return to the galaxy they remembered because that galaxy no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Admiral Blake called a meeting of the senior leadership to discuss Nathan's findings and their implications for humanity's future. The conference was held aboard the flagship in a chamber that had been designed to accommodate representatives from multiple species. Now it was filled only with humans who were struggling to understand what they had become during their exile. The discussion went on for days as everyone tried to process the magnitude of what they had learned. Humanity was truly alone in the universe now. The galaxy that had given birth to their species was gone forever, and they were cut off from any possibility of finding new allies or returning to their ancestral home, but something unexpected emerged. From the despair and isolation that threatened to overwhelm the human leadership, the young people who had been born in the void were not afraid of their situation. They saw the darkness between galaxies not as a prison but as an opportunity to become something that the universe had never seen before. Elena's research showed that the consciousness-dampening fields were not just protecting humanity from external threats, but were fundamentally changing how human minds interacted with reality itself. The children were developing abilities that would allow them to manipulate space and time in ways that even the most advanced Federation technologies could not achieve. The human fleet began to change as the new generation took on more responsibilities and started implementing ideas that their elders could barely comprehend. Ships were modified to harvest energy directly from the quantum vacuum. Navigation systems were developed that used consciousness rather than instruments to find their way through the void. Most importantly, the young humans were learning to communicate with the strange intelligences that Jake Morrison had detected. In the darkness between galaxies, these ancient entities had been waiting in the void for eons, and they recognized something familiar in the consciousness patterns of the exiled humans. As the story reached its conclusion, humanity was no longer the same species that had once sought acceptance among the stars. They had become something harder and more adaptable and infinitely more dangerous than anything the galaxy had ever produced. The cold wisdom of the void had shaped them into survivors who could thrive in environments that would destroy any other form of life. The Federation that had cast them out was gone, and the galaxy that had rejected them was transformed beyond recognition. But humanity endured in the darkness between the stars, and they were becoming something that would reshape the universe according to their own vision and purpose. When they eventually returned to the galaxy, it would not be as refugees seeking shelter or as supplicants begging for acceptance. They would come as conquerors carrying the cold fire of the void itself, and the universe would learn that there were worse things than being ignored by humans.